For most people think empaths live alone because they hate people. But that's not the truth. The real reason is much quieter than that. Empaths usually don't leave the world all at once. They leave it slowly. Conversation by conversation, disappointment by disappointment, energy by energy, until one day silence starts feeling safer than human interaction. And the strange part is once they finally experience real peace, they stop wanting to go back. Because mature empaths eventually realize something most people never understand. Not every connection is good for the soul. And if you pay attention closely, there are usually 3 specific things that make an empath prefer living alone. Thing number 1, they get tired of fake energy. Empaths notice things other people ignore. Not because they're magical, not because they can read minds, but because after years of emotional observation, they become highly sensitive to emotional inconsistency. They notice when someone's energy suddenly changes depending on who walks into the room. They notice forced kindness, fake concern, hidden resentment, passive aggression hidden inside humor. And they especially notice when words and energy don't match. The WH. Someone says, "I'm happy for you," but the tension underneath says something completely different. Most people overlook these moments. Empaths don't because over time their nervous system becomes trained to detect emotional shifts almost automatically. And eventually this becomes emotionally exhausting. Not dramatic, just exhausting. Because the empath slowly starts realizing that much of modern social interaction is performance. People carefully edit their personalities depending on the audience. They suppress what they truly feel. They say what sounds acceptable, manage impressions, protect egos, play roles, and mature empaths slowly lose interest in participating in that game. Not because they think they're better than everyone else, but because pretending drains them. Especially after years of trying to maintain connections that never felt emotionally genuine. This is why many empaths become quieter as they get older, not weaker, quieter. They stop forcing conversations that feel emotionally empty. They stop chasing friendships built only on convenience. They stop over-explaining themselves to people who already decided to misunderstand them. And slowly something inside them changes. They begin valuing peace more than approval. That's the real shift. Because for most of their lives, many empaths were taught to prioritize harmony over honesty. Keep everybody comfortable, avoid conflict, stay emotionally available, smile even when exhausted. But eventually, emotional burnout forces them to confront a painful truth. Constantly tolerating fake energy slowly disconnects you from yourself. So the empath begins pulling away from emotionally performative environments, not aggressively, quietly. They spend less time in draining conversations, less time around people who gossip constantly, less time trying to decode mixed signals and hidden hostility, and more time protecting their inner world. This is usually the stage where people begin saying things like, "You've changed, you're distant now, you used to be more social." But what they don't understand is this: the empath isn't becoming cold, they're becoming selective. After years of emotional overstimulation, their nervous system starts craving authenticity more than attention. And once an empath experiences genuine inner peace, it becomes very difficult for them to return to emotionally fake environments. Because solitude starts feeling healthier than pretending. Silence starts feeling safer than performance. And being alone begins feeling less lonely than constantly surrounding yourself with people who never truly show who they are. That's why many mature empaths eventually prefer solitude. Not because they hate humanity, but because they got tired of carrying the emotional weight of interactions that never felt real in the first place. Thing number 2, they realize peace feels better than attention. One of the biggest emotional awakenings an empath experiences is this: attention is not the same thing as connection. For years, many empaths confuse being needed with being loved. People constantly come to them for emotional support, advice, comfort, healing. And in the beginning, it feels meaningful because empaths naturally want to help. They want to listen. They want to understand people deeply. And they often become the emotional safe place for everyone around them. The person people call during breakdowns. The person people vent to at midnight. The person who always knows how to calm emotional chaos. But over time, something painful starts happening. The empath notices a pattern. That people come close when they need comfort, but disappear when the empath needs support too. The conversations become one-sided. The emotional effort becomes uneven, and slowly the empath begins realizing something heartbreaking. Some people love emotional access to the empath without genuinely caring about the empath as a person. That realization changes everything because the empath starts understanding that constantly being emotionally available can quietly destroy you, especially when nobody is emotionally available in return. For years, many empaths ignore their own exhaustion. They overgive, overlisten, overunderstand, and they keep hoping the same energy will eventually come back to them. But many times it doesn't. And eventually the empath becomes emotionally tired in a way that sleep cannot fix. That's usually when they begin pulling away. Not dramatically, silently. They answer less, disappear more, protect their time, protect their energy, protect their nervous system. And for the first time in years, they stop feeling responsible for everybody else's emotions. At first, this feels uncomfortable because many empaths were conditioned to believe their worth came from being the G needed. So when they stop overgiving, guilt appears. They wonder if they became selfish, cold, detached. But eventually something unexpected happens. The loneliness they feared actually feels peaceful. No emotional chaos. No constant emotional monitoring. No draining conversations that leave them mentally exhausted for hours afterward. No walking on eggshells trying to maintain unstable relationships. No pressure to shrink themselves just to keep people comfortable. For the first time in a very long time, their mind becomes quiet, and that silence changes them. Because once an empath experiences emotional calm after years of overstimulation, they begin seeing attention differently. Attention used to feel validating. Now it often feels intrusive, especially when it comes from emotionally inconsistent people. This is why mature empaths stop chasing constant communication, validation, and social approval, because they finally realize peace has more value than temporary connection. And once peace becomes the priority, their entire life changes. They become more selective, more protective of their space, more intentional with relationships. Not because they stop loving people, but because they finally learned that constantly sacrificing your inner peace for external attention is one of the fastest ways to lose yourself. That's why many mature empaths eventually prefer solitude. Because after experiencing emotional exhaustion for so long, peace no longer feels boring. It feels sacred. Thing number 3, they stop feeling safe around most people. This is the part nobody talks about. Empaths usually don't isolate after one heartbreak. It happens slowly after repeated emotional betrayal, being misunderstood, used, manipulated, emotionally drained, dismissed. And over time, something inside the empath begins changing because overgiving becomes trauma after a while, especially when the empath keeps attracting emotionally unavailable people. People who love receiving empathy but struggle to give it back. People who enjoy emotional closeness only when it benefits them. People who treat the empath like an emotional shelter during storms, but disappear the moment stability returns. At first, the empath keeps trying harder. They communicate more, forgive more, understand more, sacrifice more. Because empaths naturally believe deeper understanding can heal relationships. But they think patience will eventually create emotional safety. But eventually they realize something painful. You cannot build emotional security with people who refuse emotional accountability. And that realization changes everything because at some point, the empath stops asking, how do I make people stay, and starts asking, why do I keep abandoning myself for people who never truly see me? That question changes their entire life because for the first time, the empath stops focusing only on losing other people and starts recognizing how much of themselves they lost in the process. Their boundaries, their peace, their emotional stability, their identity. Many empaths spend years trying to become emotionally acceptable for everyone around them. They shrink themselves to avoid conflict, stay silent to keep relationships alive, ignore red flags because they fear loneliness more than emotional damage. But eventually, emotional exhaustion forces them to wake up. And once an empath becomes emotionally self-aware, their standards rise fast. Not in a superficial way, not arrogance, not ego, but self-protection. They stop romanticizing potential. They stop trying to rescue emotionally unavail. The able people. They stop believing love means enduring emotional inconsistency forever. And most importantly, they stop feeling emotionally safe around people who only take. That's the shift most people misunderstand. The empath isn't avoiding connection because they hate intimacy. They avoid unsafe energy because after enough emotional pain, their nervous system becomes highly sensitive to instability. Suddenly, small things feel heavy, mixed signals, manipulation disguised as affection, inconsistent behavior, emotional unpredictability. The empath notices it immediately. And instead of chasing clarity like they used to, they quietly pull away. Not because they're cold, but because their body remembers the emotional damage caused by unsafe people. That's why living alone eventually becomes less about isolation and more about recovery. Recovery from noise, recovery from emotional overstimulation, recovery from constantly carrying emotional burdens that never belong to them. For many mature empaths, solitude becomes the first environment where they finally feel emotionally safe. No pretending, no emotional confusion, no pressure to constantly monitor somebody else's moods, just peace. And once an empath experiences the kind of emotional safety, they become extremely careful about who they allow back into their inner world because they finally understand something life-changing. Not every connection is worth the cost of your nervous system, and protecting your emotional peace is not selfish. For a healed empath, it becomes survival, the shift nobody notices. From the outside, people think the empath became distant, quieter, less available, less interested in social interaction. But internally, something much deeper happened. They finally learned how to sit alone without feeling abandoned. And that is a massive psychological shift because most people don't actually fear being alone. They fear being left alone with themselves. That's why so many people constantly chase noise, relationships, attention, validation, distractions, anything that keeps them from confronting their own thoughts in silence. But healed empaths slowly stop doing that. After years of emotional exhaustion, they begin understanding that constantly surrounding yourself with people does not automatically create connection. Sometimes it only creates more emotional confusion. So instead of using the relationships to escape themselves, they begin building a life they genuinely enjoy on their own. And at first, this transition feels unfamiliar. The silence feels strange. The empty space feels uncomfortable because many empaths spent years emotionally attached to chaos without realizing it. They became so used to emotional overstimulation that peace almost felt unnatural. But slowly their nervous system starts calming down. They begin enjoying quiet mornings without emotional pressure, slow routines that don't feel rushed, music without interruption, late nights without emotional drama, a home that feels emotionally safe instead of emotionally tense. And suddenly being alone no longer feels empty. It feels clean. Clean from emotional noise. Clean from unpredictability. Clean from the exhausting pressure of constantly managing other people's emotions. This is the shift most people never notice. The empath is no longer running from loneliness. They are protecting peace. And once someone experiences genuine inner peace after years of emotional overwhelm, their standards naturally change. That's why mature empaths become extremely selective about who enters their life. Not because why think they're superior, not because they hate people, but because they work too hard to create emotional stability. And they know one emotionally unhealthy person can destroy it. One manipulative relationship, one draining friendship, one chaotic connection. And suddenly the peace they fought so hard to build disappears again. So the empath becomes careful, intentional, protective of their energy. They stop giving unlimited access to everyone. And honestly, that's usually the moment real healing begins. Because true emotional maturity is not learning how to constantly tolerate chaos. It's learning that your peace deserves protection too. And once an empath truly understands that, their entire life changes. Why? Living alone starts feeling better. At some point, the empath notices something strange. Their happiest moments are often the quietest ones, not the loudest, not the most social, not the moments filled with constant attention and validation, but the calm ones. Sitting alone peacefully, reading, thinking, listening to music, drinking coffee in silence, going through an entire day without emotional pressure, without emotional confusion, without feeling responsible for someone else's mood. And slowly something inside them begins changing. They stop associating solitude with loneliness. Because for most of their life they were taught that being alone meant something was missing. That happiness required constant companionship, constant communication, constant emotional connection. But healing completely changes that perspective. The empath starts realizing that loneliness does not come from physical isolation. It comes from emotional disconnection. And many empaths have felt far more lonely inside unhealthy relationships than they ever did sitting alone in a quiet room. That realization becomes life-changing because solitude slowly transforms into something completely different. It becomes emotional freedom. Freedom from emotional chaos. Freedom from constantly monitoring other people's behavior. Freedom from unpredictable moods, mixed signals, and emotional instability. freedom from shrinking themselves just to maintain relationships that never truly felt safe. And once an empath experiences that level of emotional calm, their nervous system begins craving peace more than attention. That's why many mature empaths become extremely selective about they take their life, not because they became antisocial, not because they stopped caring about people, but because they finally understand how deeply emotional environments affect their mental state. One emotionally unhealthy person can destroy months of inner peace. One manipulative relationship can bring back anxiety they worked years to heal. One draining connection can emotionally exhaust them all over again. And after fighting so hard to rebuild themselves, they refuse to hand that peace away easily anymore. This is the part many people misunderstand about healed empaths. Their distance is not punishment. Their solitude is not bitterness. It is protection. Protection of the calm life they struggled to create. Protection of the emotional safety they never had before. Because once an empath discovers what genuine peace feels like, they stop becoming impressed by temporary connection. They stop chasing relationships simply to avoid loneliness, and instead they begin asking a different question. Does this person bring peace into my life or take it away? And if the answer threatens their inner stability, the empath quietly chooses solitude instead. Not because being alone feels perfect, but because peace finally feels worth protecting. If an empath prefers living alone, don't assume they gave up on love. Many of them still believe in deep connection. They still believe real love exists. They still want honesty, warmth, loyalty, emotional intimacy. But they no longer believe connection should cost them their mental peace. That's the difference. In the past, many empaths tolerated emotionally draining relationships just to avoid loneliness. They ignored red flags, over-explained their feelings, stayed loyal to people who continuously hurt them, and convinced themselves that love required endless sacrifice. But healing changes that mindset completely. Mature empaths eventually realize that love should not feel like emotional survival. It should feel safe, calm, mutual. They are no longer impressed by attention, charm, or temporary chemistry, because they've already experienced relationships that looked exciting on the surface while quietly destroying them internally. Now they want something deeper. Emotional safety, honesty, consistency, reciprocity, a connection where they don't have to constantly question where they stand. A relationship where they can exist fully, without shrinking themselves to keep the peace. And until they find that, they would rather sit alone in silence than feel emotionally lonely beside the wrong person. That's the part many people fail to understand. Being physically alone is not the deepest form of loneliness. Feeling unseen, emotionally unsafe, and disconnected beside somebody who claims to love you is far more painful. That's why healed empaths become extremely selective with love. Not because they became cold, but because they finally learned how valuable their inner peace truly is. And once an empath spends enough time rebuilding themselves emotionally, they stop handing their peace away so easily. Because mature empaths eventually learn something life-changing. Protecting your peace is not loneliness. It's self-respect.